Welcome. Thank you for joining tonight's program. My name is Trey Meehan, and I'm the Managing Director of Alums for Campus Fairness, ACF. I'm also joined by my colleague, Melanie Borker, who is our Tri-State Regional Assistant Director. She was the one who let you up and gave you your name tags, and she'll be joining us momentarily. For those who don't know, ACF harnesses the unique power of alumni to counter anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel on college and university campuses. We're dedicated to preventing discrimination and holding educational institutions accountable to be remaining pillars of truth and academic freedom. As I'm sure you're all aware, we have seen a rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel incidents on college campuses, including hate speech, vandalism, encampments, and even physical violence over the last decade, but especially after Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th. ACF and our members are dedicated to combating this trend. We know we are the only organization educating and engaging alumni to counter anti-Semitism on campus and the demonization of Israel. We are a unified voice of alumni, 66,000 and growing. We put leaders on notice of anti-Semitic incidents and organize rapid responses. We've deployed billboards, created petitions, and we've been featured in multiple news outlets exposing anti-Semitism and the double standards at many schools after October 7th. We know that by harnessing the unique power of alums, we can build a better future for all students, regardless of their background or beliefs. So we invite you to join all of us in this important work, and we thank you for your support. Tonight, we have the privilege of being joined by New York City Council members, Ina Vernikov and Eric Dinowitz. Yes, thank you. Councilmember Ina Vernikov is a Ukrainian-born American lawyer and politician who proudly represents District 48 of South Brooklyn and the New York City Council as minority whip. She was one of 6 Republicans to flip a traditionally Democratic seat. The councilwoman is a leading voice against anti-Semitism, where she organizes rallies and press conferences, including notably amplifying the case of an assault on a young man in Brooklyn. City Council member Vernikov withheld funding from a CUNY law school program due to its failure to address anti-Semitism and jointly organized a city council hearing on the issue. Through her work as a diligent council member, she aims to unite communities facing common challenges and regularly appears in the media to advocate for her constituents. Council member Eric Dinowitz was born and raised in Southwest Bronx, excuse me, Northwest Bronx. I know, my apologies. Where he is now raising his own family. He's a community activist, former special education teacher, chapter leader for the United Federation of Teachers, and former aging chair of Bronx Community Board 8. As Democratic district leader and chair of the Jewish caucus, Councilmember Dinowitz has fought back against the rise in anti-Semitism and hate crimes by working with other marginalized groups to make them a priority for the city. Council members Vernikov and Dinowitz have both been champions of combating anti-Semitism, and we at ACF have been proud to support their efforts. Thank you both for speaking this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Michael Mantell, who is our ACF Hunter College chapter leader, who has been instrumental in organizing events like this in the New York City area. For those who don't know him, Michael is a psychotherapist, educator, and the grandson of Holocaust survivors. In addition to leading our Hunter College chapter, Michael teaches modern Jewish history, facilitates a mitzvah project class, and serves as a board member of 3GNY, an organization that preserves the legacies and the lessons of the Holocaust through educational programming. Michael is also part of a group of students and alum who initiated a Title VI complaint against Hunter College. He's a strong advocate for our cause, working with New York City students and alumni to combat anti-Semitism and to cultivate Jewish pride on campus. Speaking of Jewish pride, one last plug. Here at ACF, we're going to be hosting a webinar with author Ben Freeman on the topic of Jewish pride. He's an author of 2 books on the topic. It'll be in 3 weeks on June 26th at 3 p.m. You can register. This is just a webinar, so no in-person format. And we'll also be sending out communication about this after the event with the registration link if you're interested. So finally, I want to thank Michael for helping organize this event, and I would like to invite him and the council members up where he'll be facilitating the conversation. Thank you so much.
Testing.
Yeah. All right, Sue, I like that. All right, so I just want to say thank you Thank you to Melanie and Trey and everyone at Alums for Campus Fairness, ACF, for your help with this event and for combating Jew hatred on campus. Thank you to all the ACF chapter leaders. Many are here today in person and on Zoom. You can raise your hand if you're here. Thank you all. And I want to also thank everyone here in person, on Zoom, and those viewing this recording. I also always like to give a big shout out to my parents for being amazing. And last but not least, a huge thank you to the council members, Vernikov and Eric Dinowitz, for taking time out of their very busy schedules for being here this evening, and for everyone at your offices for helping to schedule this and make it happen. I only wish we had something pressing to speak about today. So, joking, I say that as New York City is burning in the background. But before we get on to heavy topics, I just want to ask if you can share a little bit about yourselves for those who are not acquainted with you yet. So maybe a little bit about where you're from, what you did in your former lives, and what was the impetus for stepping away from your careers and running for city council.
Sure. First of all, hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for putting this event together. And also, Michael, thank you for being such a vocal supporter, but also such an important voice combating anti-Semitism on campuses. I know that you do a lot of work, and you do a lot of work behind the scenes as well. So, and you testified at our hearing that I'm sure we're going to talk about. So I just want to really thank you. I came from the former Soviet Union, from Ukraine, when I was 12 years old with my family. My family came to the United States, not so much because of religious persecution, because by the time we came here, it was already independent Ukraine. But my family as a whole definitely experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. Some of them had to move to other places, change last names. I remember my family telling me about how we had to do chupot and bar mitzvahs and bris milos under, in a basement. So I really love America and everything it stands for. I love the freedoms that we have in this country. Hopefully, so far, hopefully we're not going to lose those freedoms, but that is part of the reason why I am such a loud voice against anti-Semitism. Of course, like every Ashkenazi Jew, I've had family that we lost in the Holocaust. My grandfather's side lost a lot of members of his family. So I think it's really, really important that we, as proud American Jews, especially Jews that came here from other countries that escaped anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred, should be speaking out and should be loud voices against anti-Semitism. So I was never my dream. It was never in my plans to become a politician. I always wanted to be an attorney since I was little. And I came here, I went to law school, I had my own practice for almost 8 years. And then I saw two things that really bothered me, or at least two important things that really bothered me. One was the movement to defund our police and the riots in 2020. And of course, from way before 2020, a rise in anti-Semitism. And I decided, I made a difficult decision. It wasn't easy for me, but I made a difficult decision to leave my law practice and, become a voice for not just anti-Semitism, not just against anti-Semitism, but for issues that our communities really cared about, and they felt that they were missing that voice in those communities. So I've considered myself lucky and privileged to be able to represent my community, District 48, but also stand up for New Yorkers and stand up for common sense. Thank you so much.
I'm Eric Dinowitz, born in Southwest Detroit. When the factories closed up, we moved out. I was born in the Bronx. I was raised in the Bronx. I live in the Bronx. I represent the Bronx. I was a teacher. I think the thing in my career, in my life that influenced me the most as an adult was the fact that I spent over 13 years in the classroom. Most of those years were in the Bronx. And for me, I think I saw a lot of what was going on with my students' lives, what was affecting them wasn't just curriculum. It wasn't just what they were learning in the classroom. But when students were coming into school hungry and they were sneaking those extra sandwiches and extra milk cartons from lunch, seeing the food insecurity, I had students whose apartments burned down, students facing health crises, and they would still come to school and they would struggle, but it didn't have a ton to do with what was in the school. And I grew up in a political family, my father in the state assembly. And I always knew the impact public service could have, always knew the impact politics could have. And so I never planned to run for city council, but when I saw all of the factors leading to the success and failures of our school system and of our children, I chose to run for office after a number of other initiatives in the community, like was mentioned, being on the community board, Democratic district leader. But I never thought I would be fighting anti-Semitism to the extent I'm fighting anti-Semitism, being a city council member. I think most people think city council, they say, oh, pick up the garbage and the stop sign, I got a pothole and I need a tree planted here. All of that's true. But anti-Semitism is on the rise. And it's something you don't expect when you get in this job, but it was addressing it as something that's really necessary. And there have been a number of initiatives, and I will talk about the hearing, but that hearing was 2 years ago, June 2022, before, of course, October 7th, but something that I knew was growing on our college campuses, anti-Semitism. It's something that I saw in my high school classes. And it stemmed, I believe, stems a lot from ignorance. And so when I would tell my students in September, October, I say, I'm going to take off a couple days. The Jewish holiday of Sukkot is coming up. I always say most students would be like, yeah, 2 days off. I'm really thrilled about that. But instead, my high school students would start asking me questions about my Judaism. And the first questions were a little astounding. There was, where's your hat thingy? And where are your curly things on the side? How come you don't wear a coat? That my students in the Bronx, their conception of Judaism was those guys with the hat thingies and the curls and the coats. And they had either never met a Jew or never realized they met a Jew. And then they started asking more interesting questions about Judaism. But I saw a lot, even from before college-age students, so many of them have so little exposure to Jewish people or Jewish ideas, Jewish identity, Jewish community, Jewish history, any of that. And so then you look a few years later when they get to college and suddenly encampments pop up, or they're being told that this evil country, Israel, the Jewish state, is committing all these atrocities. And they have no basis of understanding, or a lot of them, I shouldn't say all of them because some of them are Jewish. But when I see that trajectory, I look at it having to address things through intervention, through education, through groups like Stand With Us, which I know you're under the umbrella of. And that's why early in the council, we got more funding for the hate crimes initiative to combat hate. And it was for programs like Stand With Us. And Stand With Us actually was the recipient of tens of thousands of dollars of that funding for student groups in high schools. We just had a roundtable with Jewish students, and Stand With Us brought some of the students who worked with JSUs, who also worked with the Muslim student associations. Today, I was at the Museum of Jewish Heritage with one of my local schools, Kinneret, and they have this program that's been going on for 19 years where they work with Jewish day schools and Muslim schools, and they share artifacts and history about their people. And it was fifth graders. One of the most beautiful things I'd seen, I think, all year, that these young people who feel so deeply about their heritage are able to come together and find common ground, very young, experience each other's cultures, and learn to see people in other cultures and other beliefs. And I just see so many positive things for initiatives like that, education, and bringing people together going forward as we fight a scourge of anti-Semitism, real, true hate and violence on our campuses.
Amazing. And with that, I think you and members of the Jewish Caucus helped fund a $2.5 million program, if that's right. that will.
It's correct. So we
Yeah,
announced.
yeah.
So we announced, this is actually really huge. And then Julie Menon, one of the members of the Jewish Caucus, has really spearheaded this. But we announced last Thursday at the Museum of Jewish Heritage also, through a private-public partnership through the Gray Foundation, that every single 8th grader in New York City, public charter school, is going to get free trips to the Museum of Jewish Heritage to see their exhibits, what hate can do, and that's part of the education. I think it's very clear to a lot of us that our education systems have utterly failed, despite what initiatives are going on. I don't want to take anything away from that. They failed. They are failing. So we are putting forward proposals, rules, funding, initiatives to ensure that the education that we as a Jewish people so deeply believe in is making its way into our public schools.
Thank you. So some people might not know exactly what the New York City Council is or does. Are you able to give a very brief synopsis? And also like what your day-to-day responsibilities are within that? I guess that's the more important part.
Okay, so I'll start and then my colleague can continue. Basically, this is how I see the city council. There are two main functions. One is a legislative function where we go to City Hall, we pass bills, we propose bills. Some of us knock bills down sometimes, or try to. And also, I think that function is really important because it's also where we get to have a voice to speak out against or for certain issues that we and our constituents care about. And then the second function is in a district, which is just dealing with all the local issues like sanitation, schools, and just local traffic. And we're actually, can I just, do you mind? We're #1 in New York City for constituent services. So yeah, so those are the two parts of basically. I mean, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just that the reason I'm not #1 is because I took care of everything already. So everything's fine in my district. That's it. I have a constituent. Yeah, well, one of the so I think Councilmember Vernikov, so he's a good friend. I'm used to calling her Irina, but we'll be formal here. Councilmember Vernikov really broke it up into the two main parts. I think the City Hall piece is legislation, so all the laws, and there are a few bills I would like to mention at some point. But we also pass a budget, and we're in budget season right now. You mentioned that Councilmember Vernikov took the funding from CUNY Law School. That's our discretionary funding, where we can say we're going to give to the institutions that we know do good work and not give to the ones that are causing problems. And then we have our citywide budget, which is where we have the Parks Department, the Sanitation Department, et cetera. And just to be clear, there is no day-to-day. There's this morning I was at a budget meeting. I took a bike over to the Museum of Jewish Heritage to see the kids. Right now we're here. Yesterday we had the parade. I had a gala that evening. And so it's just, we had a breakfast in the morning. It's just every day is different. And it's one of the things I love about the job, which is no day is the same, no problem is the same. And we get to meet tons of great people and do tons of good work all over this. I mean, I like the district the most. We get to do it all over the city.
Thank you. So with that, generally speaking, what place does cultivating Jewish pride and combating Jew hatred have within the New York City Council and with your colleagues? So I'll say that we know that this isn't just a Jewish problem, but do you find that only Jewish representatives are tackling this issue, or do we have a strong contingent of allies that are helping back us in this fight?
I think we're going to have different perspectives.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah.
I think as Jews, I think we intimately understand the issue, the urgency of the issue, and the culture, how deep it is in our culture, especially on the college campuses, how bad it is. I think much in the same token that we care about things like racism and homophobia and Islamophobia. We care about those things, but we're not going to understand it at the same level. And I think that's reasonable. I think that's normal. we do have, I think, a lot of good allies. We have Camila Hanks from Staten Island, Eric Botcher, Keith Powers. I mean, Linda Lee and Sandra, and we have a long list of people who've been really good allies. They show up for us. I think, whether it's marching in the parades, whether it's coming to the press conferences, whether it's releasing statements, whether it's supporting our funding initiatives, whether it's supporting legislation, we do have allies. And in the same token, we have not allies.
Okay.
I'll pass it to you.
I'll take over from there. All right. How do I say this and be blunt, but still be nice? Okay. So you asked if the only allies we have are Jews. Well, the problem is that a lot of the Jews are not our allies. Okay. So, and I've actually been talking about this for a while, and it's a bit of a criticism that I have for the Jewish community in general. I think we as a community don't stand up for ourselves enough. And so we really can't blame other communities when we are not loud enough. And I bring this up as an example. It might be, you might be surprised by this example, but I bring up BLM as an example, and I don't support and never supported BLM as a political movement. Of course, I support Black civil rights. I support civil rights for all people. But the way that the BLM community galvanized, and I'm not talking about the riots because I don't think that, being violent is a way to bring about reform. But the amount of people that galvanized and came together for this cause, and the way that they were unapologetically loud to support the civil rights of the Black community is something that we need to take an example from. And I'll give you a couple of examples. When we go out to rally or protest, when, let's say, we feel that somebody got beat up and somebody got assaulted, but there's not accountability. That's a bigger problem because we have bigger issues with our criminal justice system. But when we want to come out and speak out, and I'm talking about this from my personal experience in the last 3 years, we come out with about 10 people. And politicians won't listen to 10 people. What they will listen to is thousands and thousands of people because, let's just be honest, most politicians listen to people because people equal votes. So, and in general, we need the way that the Jewish community has historically stood up for and still stands up for, like Councilmember Dinowitz mentioned, all these other important causes and the civil rights of other communities, LGBT, and all these other issues. And then we have found after October 7th that we thought all these people are going to be our friends and stand with us, and they didn't. I actually don't think that we should be surprised by that, learning from history. But I think the main point to take away is that we need to be more outspoken, loud, and we need to galvanize a lot better and not be afraid. I see this all the time. Jewish communities, parents of kids who are having issues and experiencing anti-Semitism in schools, whether it be a city university, whether it be a private college, whether it be in high schools, are afraid to submit complaints. They're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to do anything publicly. It is very rare to find a victim or a target of a Jewish hate crime who will go out on camera and talk about what happened to him.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I was in classroom, a high school classroom, and that's important because the girl that came up to me was 16, and this story will never leave my mind. She came up to me with a big smile, attempting to compliment me. She said, "I have nice eyes, like a Nazi." Yeah, that face. No, so, I thought I misheard her. I took her outside and I gave the 2-minute primer on the Holocaust. But she came back and she asked some of the most simple questions, and it was the questions like, why didn't you all like say something? Why didn't you do something? And the answer that came out of my mouth was, I think the answer to Ina's point, Councilmember Vernikov's point, is the one I think a lot of Jews think of today. It's like, why don't you say something or do something? And the answer that came out of my mouth was, I think a lot of people didn't realize how bad it would get. They didn't think that it can get so bad. The problem is we know how bad it can get. Like, we've seen this story before. And so for people not to speak up and say anything is to our detriment. And the problem we have is, there's two problems I think we have, is that people are very self-deprecating, which is great in comedy, but not great when it comes to speaking up for ourselves. And just like halachically, we're not a religion that proselytizes. It's not in our DNA to go out there. I mean, just go on the street. If a Chabadnik comes up to you and say, "You Jewish?" You say no, he like walks away. He doesn't, we're not a people that we're not a religion that pulls other people in. So it's sort of against our nature, which is why it's so important to name it as Councilmember Vernikov did, recognize it, and then address it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have allies. I want to know if it's the same allies that we have in Washington, in New York City, as far as our allies. What side of the aisle are they on? Because city council, we have allies.
We do both Democrats and Republicans. Yeah, but I think it's worth pointing out we also have enemies on both sides of the aisle, and I think that's really it just looks different. I think on the right, when you're cozying up to neo-Nazis and inviting them to dinner at your house, it's anti-Semitism, and on the left, when you're supporting Hamas, it's anti-Semitism, and it just looks different, and it's problematic. But we also have friends on both sides.
Since October 7th terrorist attacks, we've seen a lot of anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and anti-Zionism activity on and off college campuses. But unfortunately, this is nothing new. Back in 2022, as you said, you led the New York City Council's Higher Education Committee hearing against examining anti-Semitism at CUNY. I think it was about 6.5 hours long, maybe even longer. So
Round up to 7.
7 hours,
That's only because Councilmember Dinowitz let me go, without time limits.
And I appreciate that I had the opportunity to share testimony there, and thank you for putting it together and giving us voice. Can you speak about what led to that hearing and what was the impact and outcome from it?
It was very easy. As soon as I was named higher ed chair, I knew exactly what I wanted to do in anti-Semitism hearing. The question for me was when, not if. It was when. And Councilman Vernikov was a huge part of it. She brought a lot of expertise, a lot of witnesses to the hearing, really held CUNY to task. I mean, that's what we were doing at the hearing. Having PSC there was also there. Watch the video. It's good. You can either watch our hearing or watch Gone with the Wind twice. I'll let you decide what you want to watch. But I think there were a number of things that came out of the hearing. One of the things that became clear is reporting. Students didn't know when, how, where to report. And so, in short, one of the things that came out of it was a centralized reporting system. Now, I don't say this to say we've solved the problem. There are still issues with that as it relates to whether it's sharing data, ensuring students know about it, all of these things. But that was there. We got $1 million investment every year into the Hillels, which, by the way, these protesters are now trying to say, defund Hillel, defund the Jewish life on campus, because something about Zionism and it's not anti-Semitism. And it's not enough money, but those investments are there. We're still working on the training. What does the training look like? And by the way, doing this with the DOE, the K-12 DOE. What does the training look like? And who's actually taking the training? Because as it stands now, there is no requirement for professors to take any sort of training like this. So that's a real problem if we say, and I believe that part of the formula is education, is teaching, hey, this is how the Jewish community experiences anti-Semitism. But there's no audience to hear, there's no requirement. That's a huge problem. So there's still a lot of long ways to go on this, but we did get reporting, we did get investments. The chancellor did set up a committee with Jewish groups, an advisory committee. There are some steps taken. But again, it's clearly not enough. And what I said to the chancellor is, I said, I think you understand the importance of this. I'm not sure you feel the urgency of it, because this is something we've been living with for years before October 7th. And so it is a constant battle to make sure that this is addressed. The things we see the riots, we see the encampments, we see the flare-ups, but we don't see the culture. We don't see the everyday interactions and the feelings and what happens inside those rooms, those little things that are bigger than microaggressions, but aren't outright putting a swastika on someone's door.
I just want to add to that. So the reason I really wanted to have this hearing on anti-Semitism is because I've actually been watching this take place since 2015. So in 2015, and I think my friend Mazal here remembers this, in 2015, they had, and maybe some of you guys remember it as well, they had something called the Million Student March that basically turned into an anti-Zionism, anti-Semitic hate fest. So outside of Hunter College, this was the first time I've noticed anything like this. Outside of Hunter College, they had this Million Student March where they were yelling Zionists out of CUNY, Intifada, globalize the Intifada, compared the KKK to NYPD, NYPD to KKK. So all the things that we're seeing, yes, we know the chant. All the things that we're seeing explode now is actually nothing new. It's something that's been happening for years, and that's why it's been so important for me to expose it and then figure out how we can tackle it and resolve it. Well, we're not going to resolve it, but at least we can help quiet it down and deal with it. And also, I just want to mention, Councilmember Dinowitz mentioned the portal that came out of after the as a result of the CUNY hearing. So there was a couple of things that I think came out of that hearing. First of all, a $750,000 commitment to adding anti-Semitism into their diversity classes, which I'm not going to talk about how good or bad they are, but that was one of them. The other was a commitment to refer, not adopt, refer to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, expand pro-Israel exchange programs, and the portal, which they actually did build very quickly after the hearing. We were working closely with the chancellor's office to make sure that they do create this portal, and they did, but the portal has a lot of issues, one of them being that you can submit a complaint, as of now, you could submit a complaint in portal and you will get no response and nobody will handle that complaint. So in a meeting with Judge Lippman, who has been appointed by Governor Hochul, I brought this up, and this is something they were very interested in tackling. And we're actually getting in touch with them to see where they're holding. Judge Lippman is investigating independently anti-Semitism at CUNY, and he's gonna submit a report, which the governor committed to kind of abiding by and trying to implement the recommendations of that report. So the portal is something that Judge Lippman kind of was very interested in and promised to look into to make sure that's a system that works for students and that we could actually try to promote, because right now it's basically just a website.
Relating it back to the role of council members, I mentioned budget. There's a back and forth between the mayor and the council. The mayor proposes a budget and we respond. One of the things I was able to put in our response to the mayor's preliminary budget proposal was Title VI coordinators funding Title VI coordinators at DOE and CUNY to help address some of the issues that Councilmember Vernikov was mentioning, but really having employees there whose job it is to handle these sorts of things.
Thank you. Did you break the mic? I think I did. Yeah. All right. Thank you. So I have about like 3 or 4 more questions, and we'll turn it over to Q&A, even to those on Zoom. But so we know what it looks like from the outside. Not great. You mentioned some of the things that we're seeing. But what information do you have from the inside? What's creating what we're seeing? Are there textbooks that are being used? Teachers are saying certain things? Are there certain curriculum that are being used in the classroom, or how the administration is responding to anti-Semitism? So is there any information that you can share with us from what you're seeing on the inside?
I could talk a little bit about the DOE, and then Councilmember Dinowitz can obviously chime in. So in addition to what Councilmember Dinowitz mentioned, which is that education is a very important component to tackling anti-Semitism, which I totally agree with. I think there is definitely ignorance is a big issue in our city, in our country. But on top of the education component, I strongly believe that there is a lack of consequences. And I really think that those two are the two main components to tackle anti-Semitism, education and consequences. There are virtually no consequences to things that happen, whether it's at universities or public schools. But let's take it to the DOE. As some of you know, recently the DOE chancellor went in front of Congress to answer some of their questions. I am proud to have worked closely with some of the Republican members of Congress to help with the questioning of the chancellor. Papers applauded him for doing so well after. I totally disagree. I think that that this wasn't taken seriously enough, and I think that he got some softball questions from a lot of the members, unfortunately. And I think he just got away with it. He got away with saying that he's tackling the issues, that he's got a handle on the problem. But it's very frustrating for me to watch the hearing and just watch the chancellor and the DOE talk about how they handle anti-Semitism, because I see what it is that they're actually doing, and I speak to the students, and I speak to the teachers, and I speak to the parents, and the picture that's been painted by the chancellor and the DOE is not the picture. Is not the reality. It does not reflect the reality of what is actually going on in the ground. And what's happening at the DOE is that there are teacher-led walkouts. There are teachers promoting propaganda and lies to their students, which is obviously encouraging and emboldening and creating more anti-Semitism. The Jewish students are not included in DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculums, their programs, their trainings. They're excluded whenever Jewish students get attacked, get harassed, whether it's physically or on social media. There's virtually no consequences. Their complaints are not answered, they're not responded to, they're ignored, they're found to be unsubstantiated. I'm going to just give you one quick example of something that happened in my district to one of the kids, and then I'll let Councilmember Dinowitz take over. But there was an eighth grader whose mother came to me complaining that, first of all, a student threatened to kill her. That actually had consequences because they ended up suspending that student. But then I'm sorry, did I say 8th grade? She's an 8-year-old. She's not an 8th grade. She's an 8-year-old kid. After October 7th, the kids started harassing her, running after her, yelling "Free Palestine," yelling chants. She was crying at home. She was afraid to go to school. And the social worker, according to the mother, said there's nothing we can do, it's free speech. So the chancellor and the DOE can go and they talk nicely and they do a Jewish heritage celebration, but they are not dealing with the problems. They're not handling anti-Semitism. And in my opinion, that's because they're being politicians and they're afraid of the bad guys, of which we have much more of than the good guys.
Just a few things. One, I want to agree 100%. I've taught in the schools, and the consequences are lacking. And just from my perspective, maybe a little different. I think the kids who riot and who threaten people, there are consequences like the suspensions, like the detentions, things like that. I've done consequences when it came to students saying or doing certain things, whether it was against Jewish or any other group, and my consequences were education based. And so I had students do like read Mouse, for example, the graphic novel. Students, and this is a little different than a threat. Students who may have like drawn a swastika and not really understood how that is a threatening symbol. And there are different levels of consequences for different students. So I want to like flesh out a little bit, because you do have the violence, the violent language, and then you have the students who are doing the things that I'm interpreting as violence, but is not meant to be that way, or they don't know, they don't understand why Free Palestine might be from the root of the sea would be violence towards me, because they hear their friends saying it. You know, they also see their friends eating Tide Pods, and they eat Tide Pods. You know what I mean? Like, kids are dumb. But it's our job as teachers. By the way, the Tide Pod thing, if you don't know, there was a thing where kids would eat Tide Pods. Very real thing, very stupid thing. But by the way, there are consequences for students yelling, "I'm going to kill you." It's called bullying. And there are very, very clear consequences, or there can be clear consequences for bullying. The question is whether the school chooses to go down the ladder of referral, the ladder of consequences. The other problem, and this is something that I've brought up at hearings, is that President Biden updated Title VI guidelines to include anti-Semitism, to clarify, saying that it is actually Title VI a violation if you do certain things. They give examples. They sent it out to K-12 schools. The DOE, this was September, the DOE has not updated the chancellor's regulations. And so we have guidance from the federal government, from President Biden, saying you can actually use the law, the federal laws in place. The DOE has yet to do that. I will say, just going back to education, I'm gonna disagree a little. I don't think it's politics as much as it is bureaucracy, because this happens every single initiative the DOE does or agencies do. They have this great idea, great things they're doing, and it never trickles down. And unless you're in the classroom having really strict oversight, a lot of things don't get done. And the one message I always drive home with the DOE is about assessments. So if you're doing an initiative, it's a little different for discipline, but if you're doing an educational initiative, how are you assessing the impact? And assessment data can be incidents of anti-Semitism or incidents of violence, anything like that. The chancellor is bringing a number of his superintendents and principals to the Nova Festival exhibit on Monday. That's something we worked with the chancellor to bring. And those are the sorts of, again, initiatives that I'm trying to work on with the DOE to open the superintendent's eyes to say that this is a real, October 7th wasn't a hoax, or as my former Congress member said, propaganda. Well, I think you know I don't know who that is. So I see it more as trickling down, because they don't, at the top, they don't always do the job of talking to the students every day, of talking to the parents. And when the people at the bottom tell the people above them, everything's great, don't provide oversight, everything's fine, please don't get me in trouble, put a letter in my file, everything's gonna seem rosy to you.
I'm just quickly going to disagree, and not to turn this into a debate or anything, but you're right, Councilmember Dinowitz, there are consequences, there are a list of consequences, there are regulations, but based on the dozens and dozens of parents and teachers and students that I have spoken to, many of these incidents, the consequences are not actually implemented. Yes, if somebody threatens to kill someone, yes, they will suspend that student. But if somebody is complaining of harassment and anti-Semitism, most of the time, there are no consequences.
That's
also,
true.
I happen to think that reading a book, it's important, but that's not consequences. Consequences need to be punishment. It needs to be suspension, expulsion, to the point where kids feel that they cannot do what they're doing again. Education is an important component, but there needs to be punishment. Thank you.
I'm going to say, this is what I love about Councilman Vernikov, is that, like, we're a Democrat and Republican. It's not so often this day and age, you could be genuine friends with someone of a different party and also disagree and agree on some things. And like, that's the conversation. It's true. The discipline is ultimately up to the school, right? The teacher and the counselor and the principal ultimately decide when there's suspensions. I think it's important that we as a Jewish community, I'm on these WhatsApp chats where the New York City public schools, everything's anti-Semitism. And I think it's important for us to stand up when it's anti-Semitism and also recognize the moments when it's either not anti-Semitism or like when my student called me a Nazi, I think my immediate reaction was like, WTF. But the way I reacted was the education, and she was aghast. She was disgusted, rightfully so, by the way. And as I mentioned, like I've had instances of students saying or doing hurtful things. But the question for me as an educator is, what is the most appropriate response? And and they've said, I've had students say anti-LGBTQ things. And if my reaction every time were suspension, and not, hey, do you know that this is homophobic and it's hurtful? I just don't think it's as impactful. When you have the violence, it has to be clear and quick consequences. That's one of the things that I think is also missing. Is we see sometimes, I think in Columbia, there was a student who was leading the chance. There was a New York Times article about this person. And I think the consequences came months and months after. And this is a person who did a thing, then led press conferences, and then it was months later before they received disciplinary action. And when students see that, they see that as an invitation. And I think students saw that it wasn't until it got a little press that student was suspended. And students need to see both what education looks like, what different communities look like, and that if you do something wrong or right, by the way, there are immediate consequences. Because I mean, look, any educator will tell you the reward system needs to be immediate. That's how that's how adults work, right? Who here doesn't love a sticker or a good job after they do something good? The consequences, and consequence means result of action. Consequences, negative needs to be immediate, swift, and also the positive things. If there are students who are, as we saw in our roundtable, as Stand With Us has actually supported, if they are creating websites to combat anti-Semitism, if they are doing interfaith work, those students need to be immediately rewarded. They need to be immediately uplifted. They need to be immediately shown to other students as a paragon, as a model of what good education looks like, what good students do, and that needs to be rewarded as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I'll just have two questions and then we'll open it up, if that's okay. Or maybe we'll just ask one and then we'll open it up because I think everyone else wants it. Yeah. So historically, in the face of Jew hatred, we've not only survived, but we thrived, and we've made things better, different and better. And in the wake of all that's happening today in schools and on college campuses, there's a lot of talk about how Jewish institutions should be expanding their reach, and that Jewish students, professors, teachers, and donors should be making a mass exodus from these toxic schools and universities. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it depends. I think it makes a statement, but you're saying, should they make an exodus or should they invest?
Should we be out of there and say?
So
I think we can't always. So I was gonna say we can't always like just come into ourselves. I don't think we should just always curl up in a ball when things get tough, because that'll only make things worse. I mean, there's funding. That sort of depends on the situation for sure. I think pulling funding from an institution certainly sends a message, but sometimes it also means funding the Hillel more to make sure that Jewish students feel safe. So there's no a blanket answer, but I do not believe that we should be cowering away from going to school and going to college. And I do want to shout someone out who's here with me today. My former intern Emma Burke is here, and I'm just so incredibly proud of her. She's a student, a Jewish student at Syracuse University, and just recently held an Israel Pride event and is a supportive Israel event, which at any college these days, but at Syracuse, it is so difficult to just say you're going to do in the first place, let alone do it. And planning any event is tough, but an Israel event, and I think, there are some Jews who are like, no, it's not an Israel event, it's a Jewish event, it's fine, just please it. Israel Pride, standing up and having pride for that. And that was my intern. It's just so incredibly proud of her for. You could stand up. So incredibly proud of her for doing the work, being proud, and being unapologetic about it.
Yeah, I agree with Councilmember Dinowitz. I think if we have situations in elementary school where kids are really afraid, I would say you guys should pull them out and send them to yeshiva. But I think when it comes to college campuses, I agree we should not cower. In fact, we should use this opportunity to have these college students become voices against anti-Semitism, to support the Jewish community, to stand up for Israel, to be proud, to be loud. Councilmember Dinowitz and I went to Columbia after, everything was happening.
We didn't go there.
We did not attend Columbia. So when we were there, basically majority of the Jewish students had left campus. And that was very scary for me to see, for us to see. We probably met with 4 students altogether. The Hillel was empty. They were going home to study for finals, I think. It was Passover, I'm sorry. But it was just empty, and we were on a call with 500 Columbia parents, and they were all saying how they were staying home and they're afraid to go to school. I know that some of the kids, you remember, one of the students told us that they're withdrawing from Columbia. So, I think that's a mistake. I think that we cannot cower to fear. We should stand up, be loud, be proud, continue supporting our causes, and definitely not leave these campuses.
Thank you. So at this point, we'll have audience just ask questions. For everyone on Zoom to know what's being asked, maybe we can just repeat it when you're answering the question, if that's okay. Yeah. All right. Or so maybe is that okay? We'll start back here.
So there was this defense, and there's a continuing exchange of letters between the parents and the principal. And the principal is Jewish. He's actually supportive, but he's trying to be like really, really neutral. Yeah. The teacher herself is really very loud anti-Israel activist. She participates in everything and the BDS and all that stuff. So I think we do have a situation of teacher using her influence to brainwash kids under her command. But now we have this new defense. This is persuasive speech class, and therefore they can say whatever they want.
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is this. Jews need to stop writing letters. We keep writing letters. 50 Jews in a room, 400 different opinions, a lot of philosophy. Guess what? Nothing happens. If we don't become loud, we will have no results. That's my opinion. Is this public school?
Public, yeah. CUNY, yeah.
Okay, so a teacher, and you can get advice from an attorney on this, but a teacher in a public school is not allowed to promote political views on taxpayer dime during taxpayer time. So this issue, you can't keep quiet about this. If we keep quiet, no one's going to do anything.
So
I was just going to say that. For some reason, this is only allowed when it comes to the Jews. That has to stop. And it's not going to stop if we keep writing letters. I mean, do you want to?
No, I was gonna say, yeah, what's the answer?
I mean, you know how I do things, right? I go straight to the press. Media, loud voices, protest outside the school. Do things that are not conventional because we're not living in conventional times. Writing letters isn't going to work.
It's, yeah, and again, it's in our nature to just keep our heads down and hope things blow over.
Which is what we did in Germany in 1938.
I think one of the problems is if that is a speech class, then the teacher is not doing their job. Because I don't know exactly what the content was, but I'm going to tell you it wasn't rooted in facts. There was the issue with Stuyvesant High School, and if you saw that op-ed, that letter to the editor, where an anonymous Stuyvesant student wrote every blood libel. The point of the class, to me, sounds like you should be teaching students how to actually parse out fact from fiction and not just emote. It's not a bad drama class. And this, interestingly, is something both Arab and Jewish students shared with me. They said that they feel like there's a lot of censorship. But once you prod them a little, they'll say, we're just not given the tools to talk about what we want to talk about. And the difficult reality is that there is another perspective that isn't anti-Semitic, but that is not what's happening. It is straight up blood libel happening in our classrooms. It is hate speech, and the teacher needs to be told by the principal to do things a certain way. If the teacher's not teaching the class properly, which is, I think, objectively what the teacher's not doing, that is a bad rating in their on their assessment, on the Danielson rating. If they are doing something political speech in the classroom, especially during the workday, that's a letter in the file. That's actual consequence. That is a tangible consequence the teacher should have. But again, the school is empowered. I'm going to assume that the Hunter High School system is the same as the DOE system in these cases. The principal is empowered to do something. The principal just has to do it. And yeah, perhaps in this case, a protest, perhaps in this case, a press conference, or if it is a letter to the editor of a newspaper.
I also just want to say, last month, award-winning author Lisa Weimer, she wrote the young adult novel, The Assignment, which was based on an actual assignment in Oswego, New York in 2017, where students had to argue for or against the final solution. This really happened. It happened for 5 years, and it was 2 students who came out and said, this is unacceptable. None of the adults in the room did. None of the parents, none of the teachers, none of the administration. Because of them, laws were changed in New York State. So maybe that's what we have to do here, and that will change. So I just want to also add that, because she was just speaking in this room last month.
I want to highlight one thing you said, which is the challenge we have as legislators in the city council is we have very little, if any, legislative oversight over the Department of Education. The state legislators have the authority over the education system in New York. So it's, again, a challenge that Councilmember Vernikov and I face in trying to combat anti-Semitism in K-12 schools.
Maybe we can take another, I think you had your hand raised, so I'll hand this.
Thank you. So I was at Hunter in 2015, and I saw what went down after their what was originally going to be a protest around tuition hikes turned into a all-out anti-Zionist protest. And I said to myself, and I said to colleagues around, I said, this is anti-Semitic. And I said, no, it's anti-Zionist. Don't conflate the two. It's very different. And I'm like, no. I'm like Israeli, and I'm also Jewish, and I know the difference. And so this is anti-Semitic. And I would go in my social circles, and I would talk to friends, and I would talk to people I met, and I said, like, CUNY has an anti-Semitic problem. But people were fairly dismissive because it didn't feel so anti-Semitic. The incidents that did take place, they were quiet enough that it just never rose to such a level. And of course, there was the testimony and what happened 2 years ago. But I think that since October 7th, and maybe this is sort of a naive perspective, but I'm just trying to look for something to look forward to here and some kind of win, that this has been so obvious and brought to the surface in such a way that you can no longer marginalize and pretend it didn't happen. And I'm wondering if you sort of feel, if there is something good to be said about all this, that now you have a platform that is completely legitimatized by all of these protests, by all these encampments, by all these swastikas on every doorpost in the colleges that I've seen myself after October 7th. And perhaps now you have the traction that we didn't necessarily have a few years back, certainly not in 2015.
I just want to say with that, there was an independent investigation over that that incident and a few that happened, and it was founded to be anti-Semitic, or at least there were anti-Semitic things. And I don't think anything was done still. But yes, but there was an independent investigation that was done that found that there were anti-Semitic statements. It wasn't Zionists out of CUNY, people saying Jews out of CUNY. So even with that.
I just want to give you something positive. So after all the protests and the encampments and the anti-Semitism that we've seen, there was a survey done, and the survey found that after all that, 4 out of 5 Americans still support Israel. So there's something to.
I think there's a lot of, I think people are aligning the protest movement with the lawlessness that a lot of people are so against. And I don't need to tell you how illogical some of these are. I had my the budget hearing for the Higher Education Committee, and the protests were brought up. So the short of it is how much did it cost, the protest? They said between hiring extra security, building new they had to build fencing, they had to fix the roof because someone broke the roof with a flare guns. They destroyed security systems. They broke into the building. $3 million. $3 million of damage so far. And so the very people that claim to say they want funding for free tuition, they want funding for counselors, they want funding for food banks, they want funding for all these things, are costing the very dollars we are begging for as we're negotiating the city budget. And it really is just a few $1 million for ASAP for all. $7.5 million, I believe, was our request for ASAP for all, which is counselors, MetroCards, supports for students to keep them in college. It's an extremely successful program. You wasted almost half of that on the protest. Less $600,000 we request for childcare, so parents can go back to school. Parents can go to their classes where the kids are watched. We have to find the money now because $3 million is spent. $400,000 on the security alone, by the way. The security alone would have almost covered all the childcare. And so now we have to fight even harder for the very things the protesters pretend to care about.
Yeah, so maybe we just take one last question.
Thank you. How do we deal with the tenured professors who seem to be immune to any and all discipline in terms of their incitement of people with anti-Semitism? How do we deal with that realm where there seems to feel like they're in a bubble and nobody can touch them?
So I first, as a union guy, I just want to clarify, to me, tenure to me is due process. So to me means if I, and I put myself in the shoes, if I were to say something that were very pro-Zionist and I were a professor, I would want to make sure I have at least the protections of due process. One of the challenges is defining what anti-Semitism looks like, what it sounds like. And so someone could maybe legitimately say, when they are speaking out about an issue, it's their free speech right. What rules does it actually violate? So without looking at the rules, it's challenging to just blame tenure and say that that's the answer. once you look at the rules, who is the one who is enforcing those rules? Is it the college president? Is it the chancellor himself? And those, I think, are two areas to look at. I think we always want to find the silver bullet and say, magically, if we didn't have tenure, then we wouldn't have any of the problems. But even without it, who's determining how do you define what bad speech and good speech is, and who is determining it? And those are questions that I would think need to be answered first.
Well, we're going to wrap up. I just want to thank both council members, Vernikov and Eric Dinowitz, for their time, expertise, and just sharing this moment with us. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here on Zoom and in person. And have a good night.